I've documented the mechanisms of ACEs, particularly childhood sexual abuse, since I am a survivor of that. And um, this teaches children that their bodies are how they survive, that adults can be trusted even when they hurt you, that saying no isn't an option. Traffickers don't need to create this conditioning, they just need to exploit it.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. And every year, thousands of women and children in Canada and the United States are drawn into human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, and online abuses. And these victims are often hidden in plain sight, but the harms they endure ripple out across families and communities. It's a gut-wrenching issue, but there are signs of hope. Our societies are becoming more aware of how vulnerable people are targeted, including through sexual assault and workplace harassment, and how everyone is affected by things like the omnipresence of pornography. There's growing talk about the need for improved laws, policies, and enforcement tools to adapt in response. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say less attention is given to how the broader liberalization of sexual norms has rapidly destigmatized behavior that once carried moral and social boundaries, a trend that coincides with and perhaps contributes to a higher prevalence of social ills such as these. Our guests today bring extensive, multifaceted experience to these issues. I'm joined by Michelle Abel and Armando Miranda. Michelle, a survivor of family-based human trafficking, has spent the past 15 years working directly with victims, survivors, and their families in Canada and the US. She now leads research, advocacy, and policy work, including her new nonprofit Bridge to Future. Armando Miranda is a veteran of the Portuguese Armed Forces and a former UN peacekeeper, where he worked in East Timor and other places in stability operations, refugee resettlement, and humanitarian efforts. He's now a legislative strategist working with Michelle at Bridge to Future. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please remember to like and subscribe, as every share helps us reach more people with these ideas. Michelle and Armando, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Peter. It's great to
Yeah,
see you.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Difficult subject matter, but important. So to begin, could you share a bit about your personal journey and what led you into policy research and advocacy on trafficking and exploitation?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a survivor of familial trafficking and abuse, and that lived experience fundamentally shapes everything I do. My advocacy journey started with direct support work, helping other survivors, facilitating training sessions on familial trafficking and adverse childhood experiences. So, in those early days, I was integrating my own story into presentations because I knew it would help others recognize what they'd experienced. In June of 2022, I founded Bridge to Future, which is a nonprofit dedicated to fighting the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children. And I created this because I saw gaps everywhere, like in research, in policy, in public understanding mostly. So since then, I've submitted briefs to Canadian Parliament on everything from Pornhub's exploitation to human trafficking to intimate partner violence. I've engaged internationally as well, testifying before the UK House of Commons, participating in events at the UN and at the White House as well. Um, what drives me is the trafficking and the exploitation, um, which aren't isolated incidents. there's systemic problems rooted in childhood trauma, also in platform design choices that enable abuse, and in coercive control that creates invisible chains. So I've committed my life to advocating for people who are trauma bonded to traffickers and to ending the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children. So, my work combines my personal lived experience with rigorous policy research because both are essential in creating real changes.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, what stood out for me in the subject matter you cover is how sometimes you think of these things as fairly distinct and not necessarily connected, but the
Yes.
through line I can see are yeah, vulnerability, exploitation, and yeah, related to sexuality and sexual issues. So it's very difficult stuff. Armando, I'd love to hear from you. What brings you to this field of work?
Well, I saw through my deployments, I saw the total collapse of a society, what operating without the rules and boundaries that we have. So I saw that facet. Uh, I didn't deal too much directly with human trafficking, but I dealt with crimes against populations and the atrocities that are committed after a civil war. I understood the trauma aspect from that side. I met Michelle. We eventually met through an acquaintance. She taught me about her work. I started doing some background help, and more I got involved, and now I'm coming out a little to the forefront of the work. Because normally I just provide her with support and all the research that she needs to be effective.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's an interesting complementary skill set you bring together. So, which I'm sure we're going to get into as we talk about the issues. So, let's start with human trafficking. It's a term by now people are familiar with, though I think it's fairly recent in terms of terminology, like in the public's mind anyway, past 15, 20 years. How do you define it in Canada, and what distinguishes it from, smuggling or, various related phenomena?
Good question. Thank you, Peter. I'd be happy to address that because human trafficking is fundamentally about exploitation through coercion, fraud, or abuse of power. And the key distinction from smuggling lies in consent and ongoing control. In smuggling, someone voluntarily pays to be transported across borders, per se. Once they arrive, the relationship basically ends. In trafficking, the control aspect continues. The person is trapped through psychological manipulation, threats, violence, or exploitation of vulnerability. What we see here in Canada, trafficking mostly commonly shows up as commercial sexual exploitation. What I've observed in my work is that victims are controlled through coercive control, which is an architecture of subjugation that creates invisible chains. Physical restraints aren't always necessary when someone has been psychologically manipulated into believing they have no way out. The distinction from consensual migration or work is the presence of force, fraud, or coercion combined with exploitation. So at Bridge to Future, we've documented how trafficking exploits vulnerabilities systematically through childhood sexual abuse, poverty, homelessness, and child welfare involvement. These aren't coincidental, they are actually targeted. So, what's crucial about this is that trafficking exists on a continuum. Someone might enter thinking they have a choice. but coercive control erodes that thought pattern or agency over time. The question isn't always whether visible force was used, but it's whether genuine consent was possible given the power imbalance or the manipulation and obviously the exploitation of vulnerability.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to come back to coercive control is a term that's now featured in the law. There'd be multiple attempts to introduce it. It can be present, I suppose, in a relationship in which trafficking has occurred, or it can also be just present in situations of abuse. So thanks for
Yes.
introducing those terms. Just help me get a better understanding of the profile of human trafficking in Canada. You mentioned commercial sexual exploitation being the main one. There's sex trafficking, labor trafficking, domestic servitude. What is online recruitment? Help us understand like the lay of the land when it comes to human trafficking in all its forms.
The term human trafficking is too good because it encompasses all the aspects that you mentioned, like smuggling, labor trafficking, and the, the commercial sexual exploitation. Uh, the aspect that we focus more is on the commercial sexual exploitation, and this involves an array of victims. 90% of the victims are Canadian born and are Canadian women that are exploited in trafficking. For example, of 50% of all the women that are trafficked, 50% are indigenous, so they are specifically targeted for that purpose. And the array of that stems from the multitude of trauma to the levels of no viable option. And there is the aspect that traffickers, or what we call pimps, are targeting, for example, foster care use. They are specifically doing that because they are already they are already prepped. They come from abuse. They are already isolated from any sort of support. They are in a situation that they want to get out. So they entice with false promise. And from that point, all the abuse starts. So while a lot of people talk about human trafficking, what most of the times they is the commercial sexual exploitation.
Okay, that's a really helpful breakdown there. How does it break down in terms of geography in across Canada? Concentration in urban centers. Um, I think it's really interesting. Some figures here. Roughly 40% of trafficking incidents involve additional offenses. So they're also linked to to violence, to just to prostitution, which is distinct, but I would say inherently involves exploitation and is often directly linked to human trafficking. Help me understand a bit more the profile there.
So you have the corridor from Nova Scotia to Toronto, and from Toronto to Alberta. So that's the corridor of trafficking. There was an interesting report done by survivors about the trafficking movement and the effects of the 401, because it's a highway that is highly used. And you have victims that are moved from urban center to urban center, specifically and on purpose, because that creates isolation, that creates learned helplessness, and that creates dependence on the trafficker. Normally, is the boyfriend that present her with the idea that if you do this for us, this will help us get ahead. It's just a sacrifice that you are doing, and the selling the dream starts that way. But is your option, and the money is good, and I have your back, and no matter what, I still care for you. So This that I explained to you is the manipulation, is the dream that is sold to the girl. For somebody that comes from a broken home for through the effects of ACEs, they don't have an idea of what love means. Love normally is painful, or love normally is abusive. So they're gonna seek a pattern that they recognize. The promise of that in the beginning everything is rosy starts with that. The movement through all the urban centers. You have most clientele, so most is a market. So you bring the product close to the market, and the market is in the urban centers because there is the most concentration. There is the anonymity that they have. More population, easy to the difficult to detect. The girls don't know the way around, so they are more dependent. And then you have the major events. For example, every time that there is a hockey game, there is a basketball game, or any other concert, you see an increase in the concentration of ads for girls selling the service.
Hmm. Okay, no, that's really helpful picture portrayal of how it happens and where and who's vulnerable. And I want to pick up on that and ask you, Michelle. You've mentioned adverse childhood experiences and the kind of factors that predispose someone to be vulnerable to get involved with this. Can you speak a bit about that? What the major vulnerabilities or risk factors are, and elaborate on adverse childhood experiences and its connection, family instability, all these things.
Yes. Okay. So the research is actually overwhelmingly clear. Adverse childhood experiences are the primary vulnerability. So in my work, I've been able to focus heavily on ACEs because they explain so much. Childhood sexual abuse is the strongest uh, predictor. 80% of people entering prostitution before the age of 18 experienced it. But it's not just sexual abuse, it's also physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, perhaps having a household member with either substance abuse or mental illness. So there are many factors that drive this vulnerability. But in the expanded ACE framework, um, for it adds community and systemic factors, experiencing racism or discrimination, um, living in foster care, witnessing community violence, even living in an unsafe neighborhood, experiencing bullying, economic hardships. These all create the vulnerabilities that traffickers love to exploit in individuals. But at Bridge to Future, I've documented the mechanisms of ACEs, particularly childhood sexual abuse, since I am a survivor of that. And um, this teaches children that their bodies are how they survive, that adults can be trusted even when they hurt you, that saying no isn't an option. Traffickers don't need to create this conditioning, they just need to exploit it in a
Mm,
child.
right. Okay. Yeah. No. Well, it's really revealing in that if you want to look at the model, so to speak, it's seizing upon vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities show up in the vast majority of people who enter prostitution. That really stuck out for me. Have experienced some sort of childhood sexual abuse. So it's the prevalence of abuse or some kind of trauma or an incapacity to experience proper love through family instability, like you mentioned, that
Yes.
is really the common threads here. So I
Can
want to
I
shift
can I
now.
give you,
Yeah, please.
sorry? Can I give you a real example that is happening in Canada every
Yeah,
at
please.
this moment. In Nova Scotia, Preston. Everybody knows about the Preston boys, the Preston gang. The conditions, and I'm gonna go from the abuser to the victims, so you understand how these interconnect. The conditions that they have in Preston is low economical opportunities, cycles of poverty, cycles of discrimination. ACEs affects men and women differently. Women internalize ACEs, men externalize. For men, anything becomes irrelevant as long as you get what you want. Then you have the culture around that there is violence, and there is older traffickers mentoring the youth and teach them how to trade, the trade of trafficking. The girls, they have family instability. One parent has the lack of, for example, of two parents household impacts the how a girl grows and develops. Then you have a same age boy that is being trained or recruited by a trafficker to teach him. Start to recruit a girl the same age. The easy way is through the boyfriend method. Then, once he successfully traffics one girl, he passes the girl as a rite of passage. And now he becomes a full fledged. And from that point, he now uses all the connections that they have where they are in multiple Canadian cities and start moving the girl around. There is an event, they coordinate, even is not the organized crime sense that police understands. Uh, Whoever does counterterrorism understand loose or leaderless cells. So traffickers operate in leaderless cells. Is one individual controls one or two girls and moves that way, and they coordinate, they communicate and coordinate. So, and this is an example is happening. The trafficker had suffered ACEs, the victim has suffered ACEs, and both use and exploit the ACEs differently.
Right. No, it's
But if
fascinating.
I'm
Yeah, please, please, Michelle. Yeah.
sorry, if I may add, it's also a level of conditioning, and this is a cultural aspect that we're not seeing or addressing properly, especially in Preston, because um, these boys and girls, as Armando mentioned, but boys are being conditioned and trained how to actually exploit women and girls.
Hmm.
And this is something that we're seeing showing up in schools at younger ages as well right now. And these are key areas that we must be diligent and really speak about,
Hmm.
address them the way that they need to be.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, the the psychological dynamic you've illustrated here. How on either sides of perpetration, I mean, there's abuse and hurt, and it manifests in different ways between men and women, and is part of then a cycle and a pattern. So I think it's a good groundwork now to move into the different areas of focus here. I want to talk about prostitution, and then pornography and online sexual exploitation, and how they're connected. But let's start with prostitution. So in Canada, it's regulated under a hybrid model that was changed. The hybrid model introduced in 2014, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, or PASEPA. Um, it's sometimes termed as a Nordic model, and this came off the back of some Supreme Court precedent. And I know, Michelle, you were involved in the development of it. So, could you explain to us what happened here, and what is this Nordic model that the piece of legislation, our framework here in Canada, is modeled on?
Sure. So the Nordic model, which we adopted here, is through, as you mentioned, Peter, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which was adopted in 2014, and it is based on a asymmetric criminalization, I would say. Here's what it basically means. It criminalizes the purchase of sexual services and third party profiting, so that's pimping, operating brothels, advertising, whilst it decriminalizes the person being exploited. um, this was a complete philosophical shift, I would say, from Canada's previous approach. Instead of treating prostitution as a public nuance to be regulated, PSEPA treats it as more of an inherent exploitation
Hmm.
that should be eliminated by targeting the demand. The model originated in Sweden, so the Nordic model, back in 1999, and their approach is abolitionist. So it recognizes that genuine consent isn't possible under conditions of economic desperation, childhood trauma, coercive control. But we have aligned with this framework because the data supports it, and 80% of people entering prostitution before the age of 18 have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And so for most women in prostitution, having an ACE score indicated diminished capacity for genuine consent. Under PASEPA, I may add, buying sexual services is illegal. Procuring and materially benefiting from someone's prostitution and advertising sexual services are indeed criminal offenses. But the person in prostitution isn't criminalized.
Hmm.
The law recognizes that they recognize them as the exploited party.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
no,
the
this is
theory is
fascinating.
demand reduction, basically.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a really clear layout of what it entails, and then the shift that was brought about as a result. I think it makes
Yeah.
very good sense to recognize the inherent kind of victimhood and vulnerabilities of people engaged
Yes.
in prostitution. I find it ironic that some people, feminists in particular, still like to use the word sex work as though it's some sort of thing that can be that can be a good thing. I'd love for your comment on that, but also maybe a reflection from both of you, looking some a decade on in Canada and multiple decades on in the Nordic countries from this model. What do you think the results have been? I can see on the one hand there'd be a lot of positive things here, where less victimization and incarceration of very vulnerable people. But what are the signals does it send about prostitution? I gotta say, like, I doubt there's much prosecution of purchasers going on. Maybe there's more targeting of pimps and the kind of facilitation, and we have indeed seen, I think, an increase in charges, which we'll get to later as a result of that. But so two questions. I'll start with you, Michelle, with your reflections on
Yes.
this, like, prostitution versus sex work thing, and then I'd love to hear about what you think the effects of this shift have been on the prevalence over time.
Okay, so I absolutely reject the term sex work because it obscures the reality of exploitation. And language does matter here. It's very important because it shapes how we understand and respond to commercial sexual exploitation. When we examine how women enter prostitution, the choice narrative really collapses here. I've looked at data where 80% entering before the age of 18, like I said, experience sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. The average age of entry is 14, and these are children, they're minors. So they're not making informed employment choices. The term sex work makes it look like it is a legitimate job or a career, and it's absolutely anything but that. And it's definitely not that. So, exploitation is never a form of a profession, in my opinion. Okay. Coercive control is the mechanism here. And again, it creates uh, just invisible chains for from my perspective, where I've experienced exploitation, and to have people call prostitution work, to me, it seems like it's a betrayal. It tells survivors that what happened to them was, well, it was just a job. Well, how do you tell a child that? You can't. How do you tell any victim that it's just a job that was coerced or controlled in this situation? Um, yeah, I think I've
Oh, that's
covered
great.
that.
Yeah, that's really no, that's powerful. I think it's clear as you suggest. I mean, the reason why there is an appropriate, kind of recognition of what it is at its core is because it's inherently exploitative. And so,
Yes.
uh, thank you for sharing that. I'd love to hear, perhaps from you, Armando, about the effect of the legislation. As I mentioned, it seems like some very positive. Developments there, but a lot of different cultural forces in play. We've seen new charges introduced, and there are more charges now, pertaining to human trafficking in particular. Not so many, I think, around the prostitution side of things. And you do see, as we saw in the most recent StatsCan human trafficking figures, that the numbers are higher than ever. So, I get my question here is. Yeah, what are the effects of this framework, this prostitution framework, on how the issues are dealt with in Canada?
Uh, we have a great law. No qualms about. We have a great law. The problem, the implementation. If you have a great law, but you under resources, you understaff and under resource the judicial system, the law won't be implemented. A human trafficking investigation, on average, a simple one, will take a year to complete.
Hmm.
And you are over reliant on the testimony of the witness, of the victim. The victim is psychologically conditioned. As soon as she is in court, she gonna collapse. Her testimony gonna fully collapse. So we will become unreliable. The defense has the right to question the witness. They're gonna take an aggressive stance, and the victim is gonna collapse. There are cases through a group that we know that they support victims when they go to court, and in the day of court appearance, the victim is in a full panic mode and full anxiety mode. Then you have the length that a court case takes. Will take up to 2 years to start the first hearings, and in the meantime, the person gets a easy bail, which allows him to continue exploiting. Allows you just He does not need to speak. He just needs to roll his car in front of the victim's house, and that sort of intimidation, because she has the experience of the prior violence, she already has the fear in her bones. Did he contact the victim? No. He just passed by, show his presence. So having a great law and no implementation is where we lack. Do we need to make a stance as a country. Is the exploitation of women and children acceptable in Canada or not? If it's not, we put the necessary resources, like let's create a group of courts that are specifically dedicated to dealing with human trafficking. Does not need one court in each province is enough. And every case is here and treated in an expedited manner. What Ontario did with the task force of crown prosecutors that work with the police is a good step.
Mhm.
So we need to put the money where our laws are. So if we say that PSEPA is the way because it's a harm to the Canadian women and children and is unacceptable, so we need to put the money to eradicate that business. Because in
Mhm.
the end, for the traffickers, is economics. Is the risk of me going to jail higher or lower? If it's higher because we put the resources behind, they will move to another less risky business.
Let's move on now to another subject, online exploitation, deepfakes, the prevalence of AI, image-based abuse. The rise of the digital sphere here has created new tools for exploitation. In addition to those I just mentioned, sextortion is another one, non-consensual intimate imagery, these sorts of things. What do you see out there on in the landscape in terms of these issues in Canada and their prevalence?
When it comes to the new technology, the new frontier of technologies, the traffickers are the early adopters because it reduces the risk. So if you look at the span of history of human trafficking, used to be on the street, and that involves close contact with the police because it's in areas. It moved to apartments and newspaper ads. With the advent on online, it moved to online, and the biggest case that we had was the Craigslist at the back page
Mm.
until it was shut down. Now there is the Leo list, which is offshore, and because online, the law, our current laws, stop at the border. They don't implement outside our jurisdiction. Online is wild, wild west because as soon as it stops at the border, you cannot enforce Canadian law, or you can enforce it, but you need to use different methods. And then traffickers and platforms use that to their advantage. Uh, you have the pornography, the industry that films in one place, hosts the servers in another, manages the servers in another country, and that creates a jurisdictional maze that it takes a lot of police work to coordinate and be effective. Say traffickers are the early adopters, and you have in Canada, I haven't seen too much, but in the UK, they start to become public knowledge of the platform pimps, groups of traffickers that now manage girls on OnlyFans or on specific websites that advertise for sex service. So pimping moved from the street to the digital environment. Then also they did a leap to pornography because it's less risky, is legal. In the US, is even a constitutional protected right, which baffles me. But it reduces their risk of being uh, arrested by the police. So they move to an easy way of business. There are still the traffic on the streets, but the first option is less risky activities. With the advent of deepfakes, and there was this week on the news that on GOK, the ex AI platform, synthetic image of children in explicit positions were being generated. Now that becomes dangerous for because in Canada, our a Supreme Court decision regarding child sexual material says that uh, whether is a image, a real picture, whether is a drawing, whether is in writing, it can the person can only have for his possession. He cannot distribute. So I gonna find interest how this gonna be interpreted and implemented in Canada. That provision of the criminal code with the new
Mhm.
platform and what is coming out. ChatGPT also came up with the idea of we're gonna start having erotica writing on ChatGPT, which again we are dealing with an American company. They have a different set of rules. How we gonna be implemented in Canada is
Right.
a nightmare for Parliament to resolve.
Yeah. Wow, that's a fascinating and deeply troubling account of the pace of change and the inability to keep up in many respects, but also the jurisdictional challenges. And in fact, Michelle, you wrote a piece for us recently because I know you were involved in crafting some legislation down in the
In
U.S.
the US,
Yeah, as it
yeah.
pertains to deepfakes and
So,
other image-based abuse. What can you say
yes.
about what's going on there, and what do you think Canada should do to address some of these issues?
Well, so I'll talk about the Take It Down Act and just
Yeah.
explain when that occurred, if that's okay, Peter.
Hmm.
So, in May of 2025, President Trump signed the Take It Down Act, and it's exactly what we had been advocating for in Canada, actually. Um, the act establishes a 48-hour platform removal requirement for non consensual intimate images. And so this also includes deep fakes. And that's critical because 48 hours, not weeks or months, while a victim, tries to navigate a legal process.
Well, fascinating that you've been involved in this in the U.S. You were, I guess, working on it in Canada, but saw quicker success down there. It seems like a replicable set of proposals to adopt here, and we were pleased to have you write that out through MLI.
Yes. Yes.
So I want to
And
shift
what I
off.
actually
Go ahead.
emphasized in the MLI, um, sorry, is that deep fakes make this even more urgent.
Right.
And with traditional and non consensual images, there's at least an original that can be traced.
Right.
But deep fakes are generated from public photos, anyways, and no original exists, making detection extremely difficult.
Yeah, no, that's what you were mentioning, Armando. The language in our legislation and the existing precedent is such that it doesn't, allow them to be properly covered. So I can see why amendments are needed. So pornography, deeply connected to the deep fake phenomenon, almost synonymous with it. Maybe you'll correct me with the definitions. Considered quite separate from trafficking or prostitution, yet there are a lot of intersections, and I think some common features in the whether the producer knows it or not, kind of psychological trauma and is involved. And often even in the production of it, there's abuse, coerced performances, a lot of issues with minors, non-consensual distribution, and of course, here in Canada we are home to, I think, the biggest, if not one of the biggest, pornography sites, Pornhub. And I think a lot of Canadians probably don't know that. So maybe you could help us understand what some of the issues are in the pornography landscape as it relates to issues of trafficking, of exploitation, and coercion?
When it comes to pornography, you have what the Canadian law says and what the Canadian culture says. And the Canadian culture mirrors a lot what the American culture is. And in the US, like I say, pornography is a free speech, constitutional rights, and they have a free reign in what they do. In Canada, you have content that it wouldn't be allowed to happen because in the Canadian law says that you cannot consent to harm to be done to you. That's a Canadian law legal principle. The category of bondage and rough intercourse is already excluded because there is harm done. Then there is the aspect of where the clips are filmed. How do we know, or can you distinguish 18-year-old Canadian girl and an 80-year-old Romanian girl? What's the difference? Or 18-year-old Sri Lanka girl? We don't. We culturally we may be able to identify 18-year-old Canadian girl, or at least have an idea that she's in that range, 18 to 17 to 18. When it comes to outside our culture, we have troubles in doing that, and that's a gray area that some sexual material may be exploited on legal platforms, and they will have troubles. I have to be honest and say that their legal department and their content moderators will have troubles in identifying the physiognomical difference between different girls from different countries. I give that. One thing that was revealed in pornography, and there was a leak of undercover tapes that interview MindGeeks and Now employees, that they say that while they verify the age of the person that uploads the video, they don't verify the age of the participant in the image, and that's a legal loophole that they are using. In the United States, every actor that participates in a pornographic video must sign a consent of that they agree with what is being filmed, and that they have to show government ID, and the company that is filming must keep that in records. In Canada, we don't have that legal requirement. It's something that needs to be worked through our legislative process.
Mm.
When it comes to harms that is done, I found an interview of a Canadian porn actress, and was interesting. It was a French interview that she went to the Czech Republic to film, and during her film, she found the girls living in the same building. She found girls on substance abuse, and this image may be distributed now on platforms under the disguise that is uploaded from the Czech Republic. They verify the age, and our laws does not cover that.
Mm.
And if I may add to that, much of the content on pornography sites is non-consensual, and 75% of trafficking survivors had intimate images distributed online.
Mm-hmm.
And Pornhub and similar platforms profiting from hosting this content. So the line between pornography site and distribution platform for
Hmm.
sexual exploitation material collapses when you actually examine what they actually host.
Mm.
And so minors and pornography is a massive problem that we must tackle.
Yeah, and I have to say, just hearing all of the nuances here and attempting to parse through this, it's the like the Pandora's box that the unregulated, unfiltered internet has created. But if you want to simplify things a little bit, just like with prostitution, or as some would say, so-called sex work, I mean, pornography is not good. It's not doing anyone any good, the consumers or anyone involved. So, and it's interesting that and I want to return to this actually, that in fact, Canadian law already prohibits violent and non-consensual. There are a couple of other things. Perhaps you could elaborate. Images or video or pornography, and that under that basis, you would argue that many of it, in fact, is already illegal. Could you elaborate on that point?
Yes. Uh, we when we submit our briefing for the Bill S209, we studied the French report Porn Criminality and a UK study done on pornography from a university, UK university. And they analyzed the videos that are on the websites. So this is their data. They analyzed the videos and they found that 92% of the content falls under the French criminal code. And there are multiple offenses that can be laid to according to the videos. Now, what the report does not say is the videos just French or is just all the videos in general?
Mm.
Let's assume that is all the videos in general. If we were to mirror the French law to the Canadian law, the same laws apply in Canada. Now, in Canada, we have a Supreme Court test to determine what is an obscene content, which is the Butler test. That was made out of a Supreme Court decision, R versus Butler, regarding the obscenity. If we use that framework, and which will be the ideal regulatory body, the CRTC. The CRTC uses that framework and goes through all the content that is in the pornographic websites and informs the hosting websites, you cannot show this content in Canada. You will have a reduce that only 8% of the videos are legal in Canada. That makes an unviable market. So
Hmm. Yeah, that is fascinating.
we have great laws, the implementation.
No, it's a common theme. It's the same thing with the prostitution framework. I think it's clear, and it's because the culture or the demand is very different from the laws constraining, or even the enforcement willingness and tools that can go after that appropriately. So wow, that's very revealing. So I want to shift now to another topic: sexual assault, domestic violence. Over the past decade, police reported sexual assaults. They've risen significantly as awareness campaigns like the Me Too movement have grown. Um, do you think we're seeing more incidents, more reporting, or both?
I think it's important to address the correlation, which is well established in sexual violence and pornography consumption, if I may, Peter.
Hmm.
And though the industry fights, recognition of it, multiple studies actually show that pornography consumption correlates with sexually aggressive behaviors which reduced empathy for rape victims and acceptance of violence against women predominantly. So the analysis of pornography content found that 90% depicts violence against women, such as strangulation, hitting, verbal abuse. These were all presented as normal sexuality. But for young people accessing pornography as primary sexual education, the average first exposure that we're seeing, which is very important to address, is about 8 to 10 years old. And there's stats that we have that, they cap it around 10 years. But I can say that I have dealt with minors between 8 to 10 years old that's actually viewing this. So um, the mechanism isn't that every uh, pornography user becomes violent. I'm not trying to say that. However, pornography normalizes violence as sexuality, especially in minors, because their brain isn't fully developed until their mid 20s. And that's science, right? We have scientific evidence to prove that. But I can say that, you know, I've connected pornography to multiple harms through my work and my observation and the
Hmm.
research that we've done here at Bridge to Future.
Hmm.
And it provides actually, a grooming tool. Traffickers show pornography to children, for
Hmm.
example, to normalize sexual abuse.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, like you can see, it's another clear example of the interconnectedness of many of these issues. Returning and delving into the issue of sexual assault and domestic violence a bit further. So you've talked about the links between pornography and these things. I wonder about other cultural trends such as the destigmatization of casual sexual behavior. I think we know when we look at relationships and patterns of sexual engagement that there are higher rates of sexual and physical violence among unmarried or cohabitating couples than among married ones, and we've certainly seen changes in the population with respect to norms around this. Also, see LGBTQ populations, they report higher levels of sexual and partner violence than heterosexual populations. So I'm wondering if you could comment on some of these other cultural trends and how they affect the prevalence of sexual and domestic violence.
Yes. If we look at our culture since the 50s, we had massive shifts in our culture. We went from a society that came out of the Second World War to start to rebuild, and we went through the sexual revolution of the 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and all the constant liberalizations that happened. That not only reflects on the cultural in general, but also specifically that we start normalizing sexuality. Was unheard before, or what happened in the bedroom used to stay in the bedroom. Now is an identity. You identify yourself by what you do in the bedroom, and that shifts that happen between in our culture, in our the way that we express our sexuality, move with what we are exposed in media and what we are exposed in pornography. In media, we start seeing more portraying of same-sex couples, and then we saw the reflect shift in society that it started to become acceptable. In pornography, we start seeing more violent type of pornography. There is an escalation. A person may start with what they call vanilla, and then there is an escalation for more violent and more violent. Why? Because our brain start getting used to the dopamine hits and requires a stronger hit, a stronger stimulation to get to the same level. Like a drug addict that increases the doses of the drug until overdoses. So our brains, when it comes to stimulation that we get from pornography, is the same level. What was acceptable as a child seeing a naked woman in a lingerie magazine, and a young boy would get all excited. As a young man, now he needs a more violent type of pornography to get the same level of excitement.
Mhm.
This causes changes. When studies done that interview young boys, and 30% says that no, it's okay to eat a girl. They like being pressured to have sex. That's a cultural change that we may have gone a little too far, and we
Mhm.
need to rail it in, because now we start normalizing the future sexual predators that our court system's gonna deal in the future. Because
Mhm.
this is what young boys seeing today. They're gonna become the law-abiding citizens, or they're gonna become the the lawbreakers of our society. If we normalize today that sexual violence is acceptable towards women, or even towards a same-sex partner, or even towards a transgender person, we're gonna have that predator in 15 to 20 years down the road. So saying today that we need to restrict to access the content, we are preventing future victims from showing up in the future.
And also, if I may add to this, Peter, from my culture, which is in the Caribbean, when we talk about behaviors, it is acceptable for little boys and girls to dance provocatively, for instance. It's culture, it's the music, and in actuality, what I've seen in certain families, Caribbean families, you know, if you don't engage in certain types of behavior, it's frowned upon. And so I just wanted to address that because culture is very important when we're addressing all these issues. What's acceptable? What is normalized? Um, and also, the children become conditioned to those behaviors and patterns.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think you can see that certainly culturally, and then through the increased prevalence of pornography and how sexuality is depicted.
Yes.
And I think it's also very clear there is data on this, Canadian data, showing that the higher prevalence of sexual violence and domestic violence in um, like unmarried, cohabitating, a kind of sexually promiscuous lifestyle, and I think that's certainly worth noting.
Yeah.
Before we conclude, or you want to say something on that, Michelle? Go ahead.
No, I just, I try to stay away from that because even when I have tried to address it in certain forums or platforms, there are survivors that feel that that's a judgment call
Right.
on how they live. So we can run into problems in addressing that, even though it's all connected, and we need to address them,
Yeah.
especially in various groups, which we've
Yeah.
already spoken about, that are most vulnerable.
Right.
And we certainly have the evidence through ACEs,
Right.
right? This is
Yeah.
not something that we're just making up. It's there. The
Right.
stats are there.
Yeah, no, you're quite right to to draw attention to the manner of going about very sensitive issues like this. I mean, that's part of the reason why people refer to, prostitution as sex work. It's to, get a sense of validation for something, and so it's very understandable. But it's also important, as you say, to state what the facts are and what's harmful and what isn't. And so, anyway, before we conclude, I want to ask you about some of the existing legislative framework for related to these issues, and then Bill C-16, which is before us now. So there's this mandatory charge policy and mandatory prosecution policies for intimate partner violence, domestic violence that were introduced in the 80s. I think at the time, this idea that this would help, and you can see why from what you've described about the psychology of victimization, people having trouble bringing forward claims, right? Who have been abused. So there's some thinking that this would help, but in fact, and I'd like to hear more from you on this, it seems as though these policies may have disincentivized or created some adverse consequences in terms of how these issues are enforced and prosecuted. So I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are on that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's look at the dynamics of the relationship in a domestic violence situation, so we can understand then how impacts how the case is prosecuted. Let's say a young woman that is in abusive relationship for 3 or 4 years, and finally, after a severe beating, she's taken to hospital and then charges are pressed. She is so conditioned mentally, she's so conditioned that she will never risk the wrath of the abuser ever again. And if it means saying that she fell under through the stairs, no, he didn't do it, she will do it.
Mm.
The problem that I see, I look at Bill 16 and I see benefits and I see drawbacks. The benefit is that by implementing coercive control, that can explain the victim behavior.
Sorry,
If
Armando, can I pause for just a second here? Could you explain what Bill C-16 is and what it covers, and then just define coercive control, then get
okay,
into what you're...
okay, Bill 616 is the Victim Protection Act. It addresses the issue of coercive control. It addresses the issue of femicide and the issue of threatening to publish intimate image. The bill has good intentions. It can be effective tool. For example, it can be an effective tool for intimate partner violence. But it requires that every police officer and every crown prosecutor becomes a behavior specialist, because they need to be. Coercive control was first studied after the Korean War to understand the changes of behavior in American POWs. Later in the 90s, a feminist writer published a comparison between the torture that was inflicted on the American POWs to domestic violence. And the patterns match precisely. It matches even across cultures and across language. So the tools are universal. It works the same way, whether it's with a Canadian, whether it's with Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding the framework, and for a police officer responding to a call of domestic violence, I don't believe that you'll be capable to understand all the nuances, with all the respect to the great officers that we have, but because the nuances are so subtle, because it interferes with normal relationships, trying to help somebody stop smoking. The the demand of you need to stop smoking, there is a budget constraint and everything. All of this falls under coercive control. So that nuance, it requires a lot of experience as a behavior analyst, and that requires making every police officer a behavior analyst. If the government is willing to invest the money in doing that, we have a great law, we have great law enforcement, and that will solve a lot of issues. In the courts, you cannot use the victim testimony as she said, he said. You can use the victim testimony as use the questions that you ask to show the patterns of coercive control, the abuse, the threats, the demands, the even the rewards, the overpower, over presence. If you
Mm-hmm.
use the questions that way, then you can thank the victim for her testimony, for the describing of the accounts, and you can turn to the jury and say, as you can see, I just described by her testimony, I just described to you all the patterns of coercive control. So
Right.
you're not using us. He did. She's saying that he did this. No, you are using her testimony to show what he did. There is a tool of trauma awareness interviewing that the police uses to draw back on memories, because on top of all of this we have the neurobiology of trauma, of how the brain encodes the trauma. A survivor of any sort of abuse and trauma may not record the events in a linear way, like we like to understand. 9 o'clock, this happened, 9:01, this happened, 9:02, this happened. No, they may record, uh, he came home, I felt that he came home aggressive, I withdrew, I focus on this smell, or he came smelling like this. So to interview a victim of trauma, you have to start by the outer layer. What did you felt? What smells did you sense? What sounds did you hear? Uh, how this made you feel? And then you start helping and unravel the memories that are in there. This needs to be done very skillful and very carefully, because if it's not done properly, you risk causing a nervous breakdown and a massive panic attack on that person.
Yeah.
Now, gather all of this, put it in a court setting. And the risk for the person is why most of the victims recant, is why most of the victims don't even come forward, because they're going to be heavily re traumatized by just describing what happened to them. So,
Yeah, and maybe just to come back to mandatory charge, then I can see, in light of that, very descriptive account of the psychological dynamics that, in fact, you're bringing things forward. You may not want to, even if you do. There's such psychological difficulty in proceeding and having a successful conviction. So it for these reasons, the policy framework I think has a lot of issues with it, and people are recognizing this now. Let's go back to Bill C-16 and talk about coercive control. So evidently, as you pointed out, there are some key identifiable features. It is something you can recognize, and it is very clear instance of coercion, and should be, if able to be properly identified, prohibited. Although it can be very difficult, as you're suggesting, for someone to properly identify, a pattern of it versus just like instances of arguments, disagreements that could be, if not carefully, understood, and the definition not precisely established, improperly categorized as coercive control. So, what do you think the bill does in this regard? It has a lot of good intentions, a lot of good elements. I think some room for improvement as well. What would you say about it in light of the definition of coercive control there right now?
Again, again, it's easy to give you an example. Bill 16 can be the ultimate tool that eliminates sex trafficking in Canada. And why I'm saying this? If you look at the patterns of behavior of the pimp, of, of the abuse, you'll be able to identify all the steps of coercive control. And by identifying his behavior as the coercive person, you use the testimony of the victim not as what he did to you. No, just describe to me what is living with him all over these years. And the Crown prosecutor has to walk the person using the coercive control framework and using her testimony to support all the steps of the framework. Once he finishes questioning of the victim, he has to have 5 or 6 of the steps clearly identified to show the judge or the jury this is what this individual is, this is why we charge him with coercive control. On top of this, I would say that any person that is charged with human trafficking in this situation with coercive control should be charged as a dangerous offender. Because once you start targeting another human being, you rarely move back from that. So, using this way with resources to the police to train them in behavior analysis, with the resources to the Crown to teach them how to interrogate the victims using the coercive control framework and the trauma informed interrogation that the police is already using, Bill 16 has the potential to eliminate human trafficking in Canada. So that's my view in terms of how the bill can be effective.
Right. Now, with respect to the definition, though, there are a number of issues with it. I think you've described like the pattern. It's not precisely defined right now. There are some broad definitions, right? Like attempting to control. It can also capture some normal dynamics. So, what needs to change about the bill for it to be effective?
But the bill needs to be specific in terms of what is identifying. And the
Mm,
best way is using the military example of identification of coercive control and the domestic violence and use that as a framework. Clearly state. Why
gotcha.
is that? Let's say that I have a farm and me and my wife, we are farming and working on our farm. Everything goes well. Our relationship is perfect. But one year we have a bad crop. Our relationship gets strained. There is restrictions in the finances. We may have more arguments. There is a restriction in movements. She calls 911. She reports that I am abusing her. The police officer comes, not aware of coercive control, but has a new tool, and charges me with coercive control. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence with coercive control elements. And when comes to trial, when my lawyer explained to the judge, these were all the events that happened. The couple relationship was strained because of this. What I was charging correctly. The elements can be there, but entering the normal relationship dynamics. Because attempted to control by me saying to my wife, you cannot go and do your hair every week. I'm attempting to control what she does. But in the relationship dynamics, in a straight financial relationship, that's a normal dynamic. of a partner say to the other one, we need to budget things, we cannot spend that much. While in an abusive situation, no, every money that you make, I keep it and I give you some or I don't give you none. So the way that the law,
Yeah, no, I think that's really illustrative.
the way that the law is written is too vague. Needs to be precise because we are
Right.
dealing with a serious charge that if a person is wrongly charged, it will destroy that person's life. In Canada and in most of the Western world,
Hmm.
we live by a legal principle that is better under guilty person go free than a innocent person be found guilty wrongfully. And when
Hmm.
we draft laws that have this severe impact, we need to bring that to mind that we are legislating relationship dynamics, and most of the normal relationships at one point or another will fall under the framework of the law. So we cannot be vague. We need to be very precise.
Yeah. No, well, that's very illustrative, especially with the example. You can see just how important it is to be precise with the charges that are being crafted in legislation, because behavior, if it doesn't fit that pattern, elements of it that do not in any way constitute coercive control could be deemed as such. And so it's important that through the legislative process, this gets amended and refined in light of some of the recommendations that you've put forward. Before we conclude, I'd like to hear from both or either of you, what are some of the major things you think need to be done or in Canadian law and enforcement, prosecution, to deal with some of these issues of human trafficking, prostitution, pornography, online exploitation?
Well, I would say it's really important for us to continue the education and have open dialogue and have survivors, lived experiential people involved in these conversations, because oftentimes what we see in my end of work is that we survivors aren't included, um, and this impacts all of our lives, but ultimately, we must have honest, open dialogue with the people that have experienced these types of challenges. And I think it's important for their voices to be heard.
And on my end, I'll just hope that the government puts the resources that law enforcement and the court system needs. And ultimately, going a step further, even in the correctional system, we need to change from a punitive correction to a rehabilitation. Because in the end of the day, these individuals
Mm-hmm.
gonna be released, and we need to decide what type of neighbor do we want. Do we want a neighbor that made a mistake, did his time, and comes out and he becomes a productive element of society? Or do we want a menace to society?
Mm-hmm.
He's always in and out of jail. So resources
Right.
need to be put it where they
Right.
are needed. And these are the three areas that I see.
No, those are great points. And if I may, just reflecting, recounting what we've discussed here, I think some of the themes that emerged for me are just how big the disconnect is between cultural demand for some of these products that are related to exploitation. Also, the lack of awareness of, I think, the inherent harms that are involved in these things. And more education and awareness about just how extensive the human trafficking problem is in Canada. So, um, those are certainly things worth pointing to. And then I think to put some more specificity on the resourcing point, there are quite a few examples you raised about the importance of joint enforcement prosecution teams, law enforcement and prosecutors having the education needed, this oftentimes specialized education to understand the psychological dynamics and the different scenarios that are involved in these highly particular types of crimes. And then using the tools that are at already, I think, at our that are available to us, and then filling those gaps where needed. It seems like adapting to the continuously evolving nature of technological change with deepfakes and internet based provision is very important, and getting this right about the precise definitions of coercive control. So this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for taking the time to cover a lot of ground. And so I want to thank you, Michelle and Armando, for joining us and sharing your insights and experience. And to our listeners, if you found this interesting, again, please like, subscribe, and share. It really helps us reach more people with these ideas. So for Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I'm Peter Copeland. Thank you for joining Inside Policy Talks.